All right, everybody, buckle up for today's deep dive because we're going deep on this one. We're talking about what happens if Ukraine gets those long-range missiles from the West. What's Putin going to do? Yeah, you've sent over some really interesting analysis on this, and I'm ready to dig in if you are.
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay, so I mean, one thing we've all seen in the headlines is Putin threatens nuclear war. Pretty scary stuff.
Yeah.
But the analysis you sent over kind of seems like it's not so simple.
Yeah. And, you make a good point that it's something we've seen a lot of, these headlines, Putin issues another nuclear warning. And what our sources are pointing to is that, there may be a degree of nuclear fatigue is what some are calling it. Basically, the more you use a threat, the less effective it becomes.
Right, like crying wolf.
Exactly. Exactly. So all of a sudden, that puts Putin in a tough spot where he needs to project strength. But this threat that he's used in the past maybe isn't doing the trick anymore.
So, okay, if not nukes, then what? What are some of the things that your analysis suggests that Putin might do?
Well, our sources point to a couple of things. First, they emphasize this idea of hybrid warfare, and this is one of those terms that's thrown around a lot.
Yeah, what does that even mean?
Right, so it encompasses a lot, basically anything that's not traditional warfare, right? So we're talking sabotage, election interference, maybe even leveraging some proxy conflicts to put pressure on the West.
Interesting. And actually, that makes me think of our Washington Post piece mentioned the Houthi rebels in Yemen and how they've already targeted Western ships. Could that be a sign of things to come?
Potentially, and this is right in line with that idea of hybrid warfare. Putin using these existing conflicts as a lever to kind of exert pressure without a direct confrontation.
Right. So it's like he's playing this dangerous game, trying to walk this fine line.
And that's the thing. We don't really know. Our Reuters piece really emphasized this. We don't know what Putin's red lines are.
So he wants to look strong, but he also doesn't want to start World War III.
Yeah, and it's especially tricky now, especially with these long-range missiles potentially headed to Ukraine. He's got to be seen as responding decisively.
Right. But at the same time, he's also got some pressure back home. Right. You're talking about that boiling frog strategy that our sources mentioned.
Exactly, and it's a great analogy, right? The West has been gradually increasing military support to Ukraine, sort of turning up the heat slowly, hoping to avoid a sudden reaction from Russia.
Right. Hoping Putin doesn't jump out of the pot, so to speak.
Exactly. But according to our sources, some in the Kremlin are getting antsy. They're not seeing those swift victories they might have hoped for.
So the question is, how long can he let that pot keep simmering?
And how does he show strength to his own people, who, let's be honest, might be looking for a little bit more decisiveness?
So he's caught between a rock and a hard place, it seems like. On the one hand, he doesn't want to overreact to this boiling frog. But on the other hand, he needs to show he's still in control.
And this is where things get interesting because, we've talked about Putin as a chess player before, always thinking several moves ahead.
Oh boy, so what's he got up his sleeve?
Well, there's another factor here, one that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Don't tell me aliens.
Not quite, although that would make things interesting. No, both of our sources actually brought up something that really surprised me, the U.S. election.
Oh, wow, okay. We got to dig into that, but I think we have to save it for part 2. This is getting good.
Okay.
Okay, so we left off with this cliffhanger. Putin and the U.S. election. It's kind of crazy to think about those two things being connected.
It really is, but when you look at it, it makes a lot of sense, right? Putin's a strategist. He's not just thinking about Ukraine in a vacuum. He's thinking about the bigger picture.
So he's watching the U.S. election closely, seeing who might be sympathetic to his cause.
Absolutely, he wants to know. Who in Washington might be open to easing sanctions? Who might cut back on aid to Ukraine?
So are we saying Putin might actually try to influence the U.S. election?
Both the Washington Post and Reuters pieces bring that up. And they point to Russia's track record, right? They've meddled before.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's not exactly a secret that they've interfered in the past.
Right, so the question is, can they exploit those same divisions again?
Wow, that's kind of scary when you put it like that.
And here's where it gets even more interesting. Remember that boiling frog strategy? It might actually play right into Putin's hands when it comes to the election.
Okay, now you've got me. How so?
Think about it. Putin wants to shake things up. He wants to create chaos and uncertainty, both in Ukraine and in the U.S.
Okay, I'm following.
So what better time to make a move than when the West is hesitant to escalate, when they're trying to avoid a full-blown conflict?
So he might actually escalate things on purpose.
It's a possibility, right? Imagine a cyber attack on U.S. infrastructure or a major escalation in Ukraine right before the election.
Oh, wow. That would create quite a panic.
Exactly. And who benefits from that panic? Candidates who promise a more cautious approach. Candidates who might be willing to cut a deal with Putin.
So it's all connected. The Ukraine war, the U.S. election, this boiling frog strategy.
And it gets even more complicated because now you have some politicians in the U.S. who are using the fear of nuclear war to push their own agendas.
We really?
Yeah, our sources point out that some politicians are actually amplifying the threat. They're framing it as the consequence of supporting Ukraine.
So they're saying, don't help Ukraine or else Putin will nuke us.
Basically. And they're using that to justify opposing any further aid.
So it's like they're playing right into Putin's hands, whether they realize it or not.
Exactly. It's a dangerous cycle. And it highlights this really scary aspect of the situation, the danger of miscalculation.
Right, because how can you predict what someone like Putin will do?
It's incredibly difficult, and that's what makes this so unnerving. We're in uncharted territory here.
So if nukes are off the table and election meddling is just one piece of the puzzle, what else are we looking at?
Well, our sources suggest
Hmm.
that we need to be prepared for what they call asymmetrical responses from Russia.
Asymmetrical responses. I'm going to need you to break that one down for me.
Sure, it basically means tactics that are designed to inflict pain and sow chaos, but without triggering a full-scale war.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Give me some examples.
Think cyber attacks, sabotage, disinformation campaigns, things that can disrupt our lives, undermine our institutions, without ever having to fire a shot on a traditional battlefield.
Okay, now that is something we're going to need to unpack a bit more when we come back for part 3 of the deep dive. Okay, so asymmetrical responses.
Yeah.
That sounds like we're talking about, like, turning off the lights in New York City or something. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about here?
It might sound far-fetched,
No.
but it's not outside the realm of possibility. And our sources really emphasize Russia's track record here.
Mm.
Look at the cyber attacks on Estonia. Look at the election interference in the U.S. and Europe. They've even been linked to disinformation campaigns during the COVID pandemic.
Right, and that's the thing. It's one thing to have tanks rolling across a border. It's a whole other thing when you're talking about these kinds of attacks.
Right.
Because it's so much harder to figure out who's responsible.
Exactly, and that's what makes them so appealing to someone like Putin. He can inflict pain, he can sow chaos, all while maintaining plausible deniability.
So it's a way to send a message without actually having to,
Declare war.
right,
Yep.
exactly. It's a way to say, don't mess with me, without risking a full-blown conflict with NATO.
Right, but, and I mean, this is what I keep coming back to. Doesn't all of this just increase the chances of, a miscalculation?
Absolutely, and that's the danger here. In this kind of environment, with tensions already so high, even a small misunderstanding could spiral out of control.
Right, so what starts as a cyber attack
Yeah.
suddenly becomes something much, much bigger. And that's why this is all so unsettling. We're in uncharted territory.
Yeah, it feels like we're living in the middle of a Tom Clancy novel or something. But anyway, all this to say, it's complicated. There are no easy answers.
No easy answers, but I think the first step is understanding the situation.
Right,
Not just relying on headlines or sound bites.
right. Do your own research.
Exactly. Dig a little deeper, try to find those different perspectives.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today.
My pleasure. Always happy to be here.
And that's going to do it for this deep dive. A huge thank you to you for walking us through all of this. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us. Remember, knowledge is power, even when it comes to the things that keep us up at night. Until next time.